In the spring of 1185, on a narrow stretch of sea between the islands of Honshu and Kyushu, one of the most devastating naval battles in all of Japanese history came to its terrible end. The strait was called Dan no Ura, and by the time the fighting was over, the waters there ran red. For 5 long years, two of Japan's most powerful warrior clans had been tearing the country apart. The Heike, also known as the Taira, had ruled Japan for decades. They were aristocratic, powerful, and deeply connected to the imperial court. But their great rival clan, the Minamoto, had risen against them. And after years of brutal war across mountains, rivers, and open sea, it all came down to one final confrontation at Dan no Ura. The Heike were outnumbered. Their fleet, though proud, faced Minamoto warships that surrounded them on nearly every side. The morning tide had briefly favored them, but by afternoon the current turned, and with it, their fate. What happened next was not simply a military defeat, it was a complete annihilation. When the Heike generals understood that there was no path to survival, many of them made a choice that has echoed through Japanese history ever since. Rather than be captured, they bound themselves in their armor and threw themselves into the sea. Warriors, noble women, entire families. One by one they disappeared beneath the dark water of the strait. And among those who drowned that day was the emperor himself. And Toku was just 6 years old. His grandmother held him in her arms at the edge of the ship. The sword he carried, one of the 3 sacred imperial treasures of Japan, was lost with him beneath the waves. It was never recovered. The Strait of Dan no Ura fell silent. Thousands had died. An entire clan had been erased from power in a single afternoon. And the legends that grew up around that place in the centuries that followed spoke of fires that drifted across the water on dark nights. Pale, flickering lights the local fishermen called onibai, demon fires. The restless spirits of the Heike warriors, still wandering the shoreline where they had fallen. Even the crabs that lived in those waters were said to carry the faces of drowned samurai on their shells. The dead, it seemed, had never really left. Several centuries after the battle, in the coastal town of Akamagaseki, which today is called Shimonoseki, there lived a young blind man named Hoichi. Hoichi had been blind since childhood, but what he lacked in sight he had been given back many times over in talent. From a very young age he had trained to play the biwa, a traditional Japanese instrument something like a lute, with a deep resonant sound that could fill a room with emotion. He had also trained to recite, to tell stories through music and voice in a style that had been passed down for generations. And by the time he was a young man, Hoichi had surpassed every teacher he had ever had. He was poor. He had very little. But he had found a home and a friend at the Amadaji Temple, a Buddhist temple that had been built specifically to honor and appease the spirits of those who had drowned at Dan no Ura. The head priest there was a man of warmth and deep faith who recognized Hoichi's extraordinary gift and welcomed him into the temple to live and perform. Hoichi was particularly known for one piece above all others: the recitation of the Battle of Dan no Ura. When Hoichi performed that piece, when his fingers moved across the strings of his biwa and his voice rose and fell with the story of the Heike clan's destruction, people wept openly. Those who heard it said that he didn't just tell the story. He made you feel as though you were standing on the deck of one of those ships, as though you could hear the arrows and the shouting and the cold water rising. It was said, in whispers, that even the dead could not listen to Hoichi play without weeping. That saying would soon prove to be something more than a figure of speech. It began on a still night, sometime in late summer. Hoichi had been sitting alone on the temple veranda, playing quietly to himself, when he heard the sound of heavy boots approaching along the path. The steps were deliberate, measured, the walk of a man with authority. The stranger spoke in a deep and formal voice. He announced that His Lord, a great noble of considerable rank, had heard of Hoichi's reputation and wished for him to come and perform that very evening before an august assembly. Hoichi had no reason to refuse. He was a musician. This was his purpose. He rose, took his biwa, and followed the sound of the boots. He was led through the night for what felt like a considerable distance until he heard large gates open before him and felt the air change, cooler, quieter, as though he had entered a great enclosed compound. Around him he could hear the rustle of silks and the low murmur of many voices, what felt like hundreds of people, settled and waiting. He was guided to a seat and told to play. And so Hoichi played the Battle of Dan no Ura. He played as he had never played before. The assembly around him was perfectly, intensely silent. And when he finished, the room erupted, not in applause but in something deeper, wailing, sobbing, the sound of grief so raw and so total that it shook Hoichi to his core. The noble lord praised his performance and asked him to return the following night. Hoichi agreed. He returned the next night, and the night after that. Each time he was led to the same place, performed to the same silent and then devastated assembly, and returned to the temple before dawn. He told no one where he had been going. He barely understood it himself. To the very warriors and noblewomen and children who had drowned in that strait centuries ago, and they were not done with him. If he continued to go, the priest warned, the spirits would take more than his music. They would take his life, and then his soul. The dead, once they claimed a person, did not give them back. Hoichi sat very still and said nothing for a long time. The priest told him there was one way to protect him, but it would require absolute courage and absolute stillness. He could not falter, not even for a moment. Hoichi agreed. That night, before darkness fell, the priest and his acolyte set to work. They stripped Hoichi to his skin and began to write. Every inch of his body, his chest, his back, his arms, his face, his legs, the soles of his feet, his eyelids, was covered in the kanji characters of the Heart Sutra. The holiest and most protective of all Buddhist prayers, written so densely that by the time they were finished, there was barely a patch of bare skin visible anywhere on his body. The priest looked at his work. He believed it would hold. He told Hoichi to go to the veranda when called, to sit with his biwa, to not move, to not speak, to not react. No matter what he heard, no matter what was said to him, silence and stillness were the only things that would keep him safe. That night the priest and his acolyte withdrew to pray, and Hoichi sat on the veranda and waited. The boots came just after midnight. He heard them stop directly in front of him. The samurai called his name. Hoichi did not move. The samurai called again, louder this time, with an edge of frustration. Hoichi's hands were pressed flat against his thighs. His jaw was clenched shut. He could hear the spirit moving, circling him, searching. Then the voice changed. It became confused. "Strange," the samurai muttered. "Your biwa is here. I know you are here. A long silence. Ah, I see. Your body has been taken away. Only your ears remain. Hoichi had no warning. The pain was immediate and total, and he could not make a sound. The ghost took both of his ears, tore them from the sides of his head cleanly, as a man might pluck two objects from a shelf, and then the boots withdrew, fading back into the night, carrying the proof of Hoichi's presence back to whatever assembly waited in the dark. Hoichi sat bleeding and rigid in the silence, too terrified to move until the priest returned at dawn. The acolyte had forgotten to paint the ears. Just the ears. Two small patches of bare skin in an otherwise perfect armor of Holy Scripture. The priest knelt beside Hoichi and wept with grief and guilt as he dressed the wounds. He told Hoichi over and over that he was sorry, that it was his fault, that he had failed him. Hoichi, pale and bandaged and trembling, told the priest to stop. He was alive. The spirits of the Heike never came for him again. Whether they believed they had taken all that remained of him, or whether the sutra had done its work and the wounds had satisfied whatever obligation Hoichi owed them, no one could say. But they did not return. And in the weeks and months that followed, as Hoichi recovered and the story of what had happened to him began to travel, something unexpected occurred. He became famous. Not in spite of what had happened to him, because of it. Word spread from town to town, and then from province to province that there was a blind biwa player in Akamagaseki whose music was so powerful, so true in its grief, that it had reached across death itself and moved the spirits of the fallen Heike to tears. Nobles traveled great distances to hear him perform. They offered him considerable sums of money. They treated him with the kind of reverence usually reserved for holy men. The man who had sat bleeding and alone on a dark veranda, too frightened to cry out, found himself wealthy and celebrated for the rest of his long life. He was known from that time forward by a single name: Mimi Nashi Hoichi, Hoichi the Earless. His story was eventually written down, told and retold across generations, and in 1904 was brought to Western readers by the writer Lafcadio Hearn in a collection of Japanese ghost stories called Kwaidan. A shrine to Hoichi still stands today within the grounds of the Akama Shrine in Shimonoseki, built on the same coastline where, 800 years before, the Heike clan sank beneath the water and refused to rest. If you visit on a quiet night and stand near the water's edge, the local fishermen will still tell you to watch for the pale fires drifting across the surface of the strait. They call them demon fires, and they do not linger near the shore after dark.